Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Randall Krantz with the Global Maritime Forum, and this webinar is part of a series of webinars that we're doing with the Getting to Zero Coalition. The topic of today's webinar is hydrogen as a cargo, and I very much look forward to an engaging hour with our speakers, whom I will introduce in a minute. Just to let everybody know that this session is being recorded. It will be available after the webinar is finished, and we should have it posted in about a week's time. And with that, we can dive right in. So the topic of today's webinar is on hydrogen as a cargo. As mentioned, this is part of a series of webinars that we're doing on the Fuels and Technologies workstream of the Getting to Zero Coalition. And really what we're going to be exploring today is what the implications are for the maritime industry and beyond as we explore hydrogen as a key enabler of future decarbonization and what that looks like as it gets moved around the world, part of that through cargo via the shipping and the maritime industry. Speaking with us today, we have Ita Kettleborough, Deputy Director of Energy Transitions Commission. We have Sam Maraki, Representative Director of the Clean Fuel Ammonia Association in Japan. We have Brett Cooper, Chairman of Renewable Hydrogen, coming to us from Australia. And we have Nikunj Gupta, General Manager of Hydrogen Import-Export for Shell, who's joining us from Houston. So we have a very broad geographic spread this time and a lot of time zones. So special thanks to Nikunj for getting up early and for Brett and Sam for staying up late. And really what I'd like to do is not have me talking, but have my esteemed guests talking. And so what we'll do is we'll dive right in with Ita, who's going to talk to us a little about the hydrogen economy more broadly, why it's so important, and also offer us a few highlights from the report that the Energy Transitions Commission launched exactly on this topic earlier this week. So Ita, over to you to set the stage.
Thank you so much, Randall. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Ita, I'm the Deputy Director of the ETC. We are a global coalition of leaders from across the energy landscape committed to achieving net zero emissions by mid-century. And we have a strong vision for what that mid-century net zero economy could look like, with clean electrification at the heart of it, and a complementary but major role for clean hydrogen alongside, especially to decarbonize those sectors that are difficult or in some cases impossible to electrify. So a mid-century net zero emissions economy is going to require a fundamental transition of our energy system, with a 3 to 5 times growth in the power system and simultaneously decarbonising that power system, so shifting it over to zero carbon electricity sources. And at the same time, we're likely to need around 500 to 800 million tonnes of clean hydrogen per annum. That's a 5 to 7-fold increase versus today, with clean hydrogen and its derivatives, so ammonia, synfuels, etc., representing kind of 15 to 20% of the final energy demand in that net zero economy. So Randall asked me just to outline a little bit about what that might mean and how the world could evolve if that was the economy that we build together over the next 30 years. So firstly, where will the demand come from? In this electrified economy, hydrogen will primarily stem from 4 areas. So there's the existing hydrogen uses that must be decarbonised, so fertilisers, methanol, refining. There's new large-scale long-term uses, such as in steel, so hydrogen-based direct reduction, or in shipping or in aviation, where we're using hydrogen as an energy carrier for decarbonisation. And these are probably going to take a little bit of time to develop as those technologies are still coming online. There's some potential transitional opportunities where we can use hydrogen to decarbonise faster, but we can't really get to full decarbonisation from those routes. So co-firing and blending. And also there are a range of other possible uses where we just don't really know at this point how the technologies will develop and the relative advantages versus usually direct electrification between hydrogen and others. So heavy duty trucking being a good example of that. Could have a significant role for hydrogen, could have more of a significant role for direct electrification. So what does this mean? So in this world, we would be decarbonising the majority of our production. So we think green hydrogen produced via electrolysis of water is likely to be the major route in the long term due to those falling renewable prices alongside decreasing capex electrolyser costs as production scales, but with an important role for blue hydrogen with appropriate capture and very low leakage rates in the transition. What does this mean for transport? So today, the vast majority of hydrogen production and use is captive, but as we grow this economy, we think we will need significant transportation needs really to connect favourable production and storage sites to demand side. So the potential for transportation is going to really be determined by the cost differential between producing in very favourable sites versus others, as well as local constraints such as lack of availability for renewables or lack of local availability of very cheap natural gas that would allow local production. There's many options for moving hydrogen, as I know many on this listening today will be well aware. It can be transported in compressed form, liquid form. It can be transformed with conversion losses to ammonia or to LOHCs. And it also can be carried, transformed hydrogen can also be carried in multiple mediums. So you have trucks for smaller volumes, pipes, especially ultra high capacity pipes for larger volumes, and ships for very long distances. However, it's also really important to remember that there are also alternatives to hydrogen transport which will be relevant in this global electrified net zero economy. So differences in electricity costs and physical availability of renewables between regions may be balanced via transmission of electrons in high capacity long distance HVDC lines, which are really, there's some very interesting developments happening. It's an emerging technology, very cheap, very, very long distance. That potentially could change how much we might transport as hydrogen. And if we have cheap gas continuing to be available for hydrogen production for the blue route, it might be cheaper to transform the gas as natural gas in existing pipelines, especially where they exist, and then produce blue hydrogen closer to the demand centres. So we've got to be thinking about all of these different options when we think about the eventual role for hydrogen and hydrogen international trade. Just final kind of few thoughts to frame the discussion. Over time, we are expecting the cost reduction between favourable and unfavourable renewable locations to decrease. And therefore, this could limit some of the long-term trade of hydrogen because the reduction in costs, the cost differential for the renewables is likely to decrease faster than the reduction in transportation costs. So some of the really big uses of hydrogen transport in the kind of very long term, so more of a mid 2050 vision, might be transmission versus in pipelines. It might also be shipping as ammonia, where we don't have, with no high cost reconversion, and also shipping as ammonia, where there are significant space constraints. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Aita. So that was very useful. We certainly heard about the different options that are there, and that it's not going to be necessarily straightforward. What I would like to highlight for people who are listening, just you mentioned kind of blue and green, and just to highlight those definitions in case people aren't aware, blue hydrogen or blue fuels, when we talk about them, that is when we're using carbon capture and storage, or carbon capture and sequestration, CCS, to store the CO2 that would come from a normal process of developing hydrogen from fossil fuels, and green, of course, is coming from renewable energy. Thank you for that. You also spoke a little bit about the demand side, and so with that, I'd like to turn to Sam, coming to us from Japan, who's going to tell us a little bit about the demand side in Japan. Japan has very high aspirations for the hydrogen economy. And one of the ways they're looking at that is through the use and even the import of ammonia. So Sam, over to you.
Thank you, Randall. And I want to share the screen. Our Clean Fuel Ammonia Association is an organization with more than 120 international members to promote the implementation of fuel ammonia value chain. Among the hydrogen carriers to transport hydrogen for long distance over ocean by liquid form, ammonia is the most realistic hydrogen energy carrier and will be implemented as a carbon-free fuel in the energy market such as power generation, industrial, and maritime market. Emma, next, please. This is our roadmap of the fuel ammonia value chain we are planning in Japan. We are trying to start the commercial use of ammonia in the mixed combustion of the ammonia in the coal power plant. We will start a demonstration using 1 gigawatt coal power station with 20% mixture of ammonia from this year through 2023. And then we will move into the commercial stage of the utilization of ammonia. 1 gigawatt coal power station with 20% mixture of ammonia consumes about 500,000 tons of ammonia. So in 2026, 2027, when we start the commercial use of ammonia, 500,000 tons to 1 million tons per year will be the offtake volume in the Japanese market. And we will expand our use of ammonia into the other coal power plants and also expand our use to the gas turbines and industrial furnaces and marine engines from 2020 through the 2030s. Marine fuel, carbon-free ammonia will be the high potential marine fuel for particularly the deep sea shippings. And in the supply side, as you can see on the top, at the beginning of the commercialization of ammonia, there are no availability of the blue and green ammonia. So we will start to take the existing ammonia from the existing supplies, and we are planning to start the blue ammonia dedicated plants to the energy market in 2027 to 2008. Our feasibility study of the blue ammonia from US to Japan shows the $2 per kilogram of the hydrogen equivalent cost to be delivered to Japan by ammonia. So it is affordable price to use the ammonia into the power generation market. But green ammonia is more expensive than the blue ammonia. So probably in the 30s, we will start the supply of green ammonia and expansion of the market, and the project will reduce the cost of the green ammonia supply, and green ammonia together with the blue ammonia will be the main supply sources to the energy market in the 2030s. Next, please. There are many potential blue and green. Next, please. There are many potential blue and green ammonia supply sources. Blue ammonia, high potentiality in the US Gulf Coast and Texas and Louisiana with natural gas, CCS, and EOR to deliver to Japan. And Canada, Alberta is another potential supply. Of course, in the Middle East countries and Saudi Arabia, Oman, and UAE are the potential suppliers. In terms of the green ammonia supply, Australia will be the high potential supply sources. And we are discussing with several projects in Australia, in Western Australia, South Australia, Tasmania, Queensland, and New Zealand, and South America, Chile, and also in the Middle East countries and Oman and Saudi are the potential supplies of the green ammonia to not only to Japan, but to the Asian market. Asia has a lot of coal power plants, and how to reduce the carbon dioxide emissions from coal power is a critical issue for the decarbonization. So ammonia could be the option to reduce the carbon dioxide emissions in the Asian power sector. Last page, next one, as a membership list of the clean fuel ammonia. Sorry, it's a busy chart, but as I mentioned, we have more than 120 international members. Shell is one of them, and we share information and efforts to realize the fuel ammonia value chain. So Clean Fuel Ammonia Association will take a key role for the implementation of ammonia value chain and try to make the ammonia to be the game changer in the energy market. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sam. I just have one question. If we can go back up one slide on the your green and blue arrows. My question is that when you're looking at the blue import, is that the import of the natural gas itself, or the import, or do you think that the sequestration will happen on the site of production and that you'll be bringing in hydrogen via ammonia?
Production from natural gas with CCS or EOR on the site of the production. So carbon-free ammonia will be delivered by ammonia carriers to Japan and Asian market. That is the concept.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And you mentioned several times kind of on the supply side of where that might come from, and there were a lot of arrows coming from Australia up to Asia. And so, Brett, you will hopefully be responsible for one or more of those arrows, and with your work. So maybe you can talk to us a little bit about that and what that looks like. And my understanding is that there's a role for ammonia, but not just ammonia in the hydrogen transport.
Yes.
Thanks very much, Randall. Brett Cooper here from Renewable Hydrogen, talking to you from Sydney. So Emma, if you could put the slides up, please. As Sam mentioned, Australia is potentially a large supplier of green energy, using mostly our wind and solar resources. And certainly there has been and continues to be a great focus on using green ammonia as the way in which we could transport green hydrogen to customers like Japan. But I wanted to highlight another pathway which is starting to develop in Australia now, and this is the potential for Australia to use its vast solar resources to actually produce green methane out in the fields adjacent to existing pipelines. And this green methane, once it's injected into the existing pipelines, can of course be delivered to our multiple LNG facilities around the coast of Australia and can be converted into green liquid natural gas for export to countries. So the concept here is to do this with modular powered units, as sort of indicated on the screen there, which are quite small, but they would be developed eventually in their millions adjacent to the existing pipeline infrastructure that we have in Australia in what we call 1 cent land. And this is the key to the concept. So the electrons are collected out where we have high solar intensity, vast areas of non-arable land, and as I say, located close to existing methane or natural gas pipelines. So the key to it is to collect the electrons as cheaply as we can and not move them, but convert them immediately into molecules and then get them into all the existing infrastructure we have. If we could go to the next slide, please, Emma. The key to this technology is technology that's being developed by Sydney University, which involves direct air capture of CO2. Each of those modules shown before will have its own direct air capture unit powered by solar energy. And I won't get into all the details here, but for those who might know a little bit about this area, the capture material is known as metal organic frameworks, which is an emerging area of science. So basically you have a chamber, you push the air through, and only the CO2 gets captured. The CO2 is then combined with green hydrogen from electrolysis. Again, a small electrolysis unit sits in each of these modules. The electrolysis unit is no bigger than a microwave oven. Then when those two gases go through a methanator, then you've got CH4. So if you can go to the final slide now, please, Emma. So here's just a couple of little graphs to highlight the point. The first of the little grey boxes is just to show you the network of the transmission pipelines that exist in Australia at the moment, which are already moving methane around. You can imagine those areas are opening up now, new areas around them, around the pipelines, which are in very high solar, low-cost lands, which could eventually support thousands and thousands of hectares, or millions of hectares, in fact, of green methane production plants. So I'm probably out of time there, Randall, so I'm going to stop there and wait for questions. Thank you.
That sounds great, and I'm sure there will be. I have some myself that around piping of methane versus piping of hydrogen, but we'll come back to that after our final speaker. So with that, Nick Kunj, I'd like to turn over to you to give us the view from Houston, kind of an appropriate place to be talking about hydrogen in this day and age. So Nick Kunj, to you for Shell's perspective and import-export. I mean, we've seen a lot of arrows on charts. What's it look like in real life?
Very much so, Randall. Thanks very much for having me on the panel today. I'm delighted to join the panel with my friends Muraki-san and Brett Cooper. So it's no surprises that we know each other. If you can pop up the slide. Right. So I think it's been discussed before, but I just like to re-emphasize that hydrogen is not just needed for difficult to abate sectors, such as marine, aviation, heavy-duty trucks, industry, but it's also needed for large-scale carbon-free energy transport across the world. And I'd prefer if you go to the slide number 2 here, please. Yeah. So again, this is a slide very much like Muraki-san showed, where we're kind of showing now, if you look into sort of the world also in the future, like we have today, we will have energy short markets, even accounting for the renewable energy potential of those markets. Yeah. So there is this disparity of energy which exists today and mostly served by oil and LNG. And this disparity continues to exist in future, where even accounting for renewable energy potential, you will need to move energy from resource-rich countries to energy-short countries. Now, in the future frame, we are talking about in these regions or countries wanting to meet their carbon commitments, and so they would want the energy to come by way of carbon-free forms, and hydrogen is really the leading option there. And very much like LNG flows of today, but without carbon in future. Next slide, please. So, and it's not, we are talking about long distance, we are talking about large scale. And so it's really impossible to do so when we talk about large, type of movement for hydrogen to be doing with gaseous hydrogen. So we are looking at sort of multiple options here. The world is looking at liquid hydrogen, ammonia, and liquid organic hydrogen carriers as the 3 leading options to move carbon-free energy. We Shell are equally looking at all 3, yeah, but our priority is liquid hydrogen. This chart here to the left shows relative competitiveness. We think they are all sort of competitive in this map, but liquid hydrogen and ammonia are sort of equally competitive when it comes to their sort of economic cost targets. As I mentioned, we are prioritizing liquid hydrogen development, not just because we think it's going to be one of the leading options, but also it's the one which needs development. Ammonia, as Muraki-san mentioned, is more or less ready in terms of from a supply chain perspective. So in that respect, we are involved in development of this big, beautiful vessel that you see to the right, together with our partners in Japan, Kawasaki Heavy Industry and Iwatani Corporation. And we expect to sail this vessel later this year. We're looking forward to commercializing a liquid hydrogen supply chain by 2030 with a very affordable cost target for the same. And I'd stop here in interest of time, Randall.
Thank you very much, Nick Kunj, and thank you to all the speakers for the interesting information that you've shared. We've had one question that a couple of questions that came in through the chat. So for those who haven't had a chance to pop your questions in the chat, please do that. We'll do our best to answer them in the time that we have left. There was one question Aita, to you that was specifically on why renewable energy prices might become less geographically differentiated over time, given that there's a significant driver of sun and wind as resources, and almost balancing that with the graph that Nikunj shared, which shows obviously some places are more renewable rich than others. Just wondering what the analysis was behind that statement that you made.
Absolutely. So obviously green hydrogen production costs depend crucially on that cost of zero carbon electricity, and it does today differ considerably. Especially renewable production differs considerably across regions. So currently you've got favorable regions which are producing at below $20 per megawatt hour, and so that would be locations with very abundant land, sun, wind, so North Africa, Spain, Australia, Chile, and then you have other less favorable regions producing at over $100 per megawatt hour, such as in Japan, as we heard, and those significant constraints there for variable renewable production. There are significant reductions expected across the renewable production technologies, so both in the upfront capital costs, so that the cost to install due to cheaper equipment and installation, and also in the total levelized cost of electricity, so the generation cost, the cost per the megawatt hour of production, which will be driven by increasing capacity factors. So the technology is getting better, so we can use them for greater periods of time, so there's more hours of the year that they're producing, and also declining operational costs as we scale, both improve the technologies and scale the supply chains, and decreasing financing costs as there's perceptions of risks are decreased. And so over these costs will decrease across all regions, but they'll have the biggest impact on those regions that are currently highest cost, especially where the reason that they're highest cost is not due to land availability. So, as we've heard with Japan, where there's land availability challenges, that's a little bit different. And in those regions, you would need to look for new forms of wind and solar, like floating wind would be what you'd need to look for there. So it's a little bit of a different story, but in general, the impact of all of those different types of cost reduction are going to be most felt in the medium cost, and with a smaller impact on the regions that are already lower cost. So over time, the decline will, the difference will decline.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Convergence due to that. No, thank you. That's very useful. And then, Brett, there's a question that I would have around, you were talking about the use of the existing infrastructure, and specifically spoke about using direct air capture to make methane. One question would be, is there work going along the injection of hydrogen into gas grids? So kind of mixing rather than kind of going, actually creating the methane itself. But maybe while answering that, you can also let people understand a little bit why we're not just kind of putting pure hydrogen into the existing infrastructure. Why does that not fit for purpose?
Okay, well, there's a very simple answer to that one, Randall. The transmission lines which run through this cheap high solar area can't take even 1% of hydrogen because of embrittlement. When you get down to the city-based distribution grids, we hear people talking about 10 to 20% of hydrogen going into those, but that's not where we are. That's not where we can collect electrons at 1 cent a kilowatt hour. We've got to deal with those big, massive transmission lines which crisscross our country through very low cost land, very high emission solar. So that is the key to the concept, to collect the electrons right out there where they're so cheap. We don't have any electrical grid out there whatsoever. We don't have any people around for up to 1,000 kilometers. So that's where we've got to convert the electrons into molecules. Once we're in the local transmission pipeline that runs nearby, we're effectively connected to San Maraki there in Tokyo because of the existing LNG infrastructure that will take it there. The key is it is green hydrogen. It's been produced there by electrolysis, powered by solar energy. It's just been temporarily clipped to carbon from the atmosphere so that we can transfer it to Japan through the existing system. So work with the existing infrastructure. That is the key to this idea.
Excellent. Thank you, Brett. And obviously, depending on your cost of electricity and the cost of infrastructure, what infrastructure exists, that might differ a little bit by geography, but certainly your case is very special and it makes a lot of sense there. Sam, for you on the import side, obviously importing natural gas is one thing. What is the outlook for importing ammonia? Are there ammonia terminals that are on the cards for developing or importing ammonia, or will you be looking to see which way or which fuel, which derivative you would be looking to import?
In terms of the import infrastructures in Japan or probably in other countries in Asia, we plan to build large primary receiving terminals, not many terminals, and transport by the coastal tankers from small to large size tankers. It depends on the port conditions of the site of the power generation, and deliver through the domestic delivery system, because ammonia can be easily transported by liquid phase by carriers. Not easier than LNG, much easier than liquid hydrogen. So this is a good advantage of ammonia to create cost-effective delivery system in the market. That is what we are trying to do. And Japan now planning several carbon-free port in the future. I think it's ammonia, one of the key fuels coming into the carbon-free port and delivered to the market.
Thank you. And I saw that just last week there was a press release from Germany. There's a there had been a planned LNG port in Wilhelmshaven, and the operator Uniper basically has scratched that idea and has now committed to making an ammonia import terminal. So that was a very interesting case, because it was actually something on this kind of balance between, will it be LNG, will it be ammonia? That was something that happened in Germany.
That's possible. That's possible. LPG storage tanks and possibly the LNG, even LNG storage tanks can be converted to the ammonia storage tank. So we can utilize existing facilities.
Excellent, thank you. So basically on the Australian side, we're looking at how to capitalize on the existing infrastructure. And Sam, you're telling us that in Japan, and in other places, there's a possibility to do that as well. We had some questions in around the comparing costs of the hydrogen, ammonia, and LOHC. So Nikunj, to you, maybe you can clarify a little bit about how the cost comparison of those three fuels that you presented, how that's conducted. Is this on a life cycle cost basis, operational cost, or anything that you can share with us would be useful?
It is thanks, Andrew. It is a cost basis of I don't believe it includes the life cycle cost, but it includes the life cycle emissions in it, which is not shown here. Yeah, but it is a pure play cost basis of which includes operational cost, capital cost, maintenance cost. So really the way we look at costs, allowing for everything. So it's inclusive of everything is what I would say. Okay. And it's cost of supply until the import point. So it includes the cost of shipping in it.
Yeah, one comment from me is that the cost comparison is based on the use of hydrogen. So the carriers to be transfer to the hydrogen. But in case of our feasibility study, ammonia will be directly used in the by the combustion technology. So the conversion cost can be reduced from the hydrogen.
And Nikunj, thank you, Sam. And Nikunj, building on that, you showed a picture of a liquid hydrogen carrier, and that obviously is a beautiful vessel, and it's one that's coming in the near term. But what would need to happen for that to be scaled up? What would need to happen for the for liquid hydrogen to be competitive on the way that we're kind of exporting or transporting crude today? Is that something that you foresee?
Yeah, I think indeed liquid hydrogen is sort of a development story. Yeah, so I think it's very easy, I would say relatively easy to do ammonia at scale today, but liquid hydrogen doesn't exist at scale, particularly when I use shipping as an example. So this vessel that you're looking at is about 1200 meter cube cargo. And if I compare it with then what do we do at LNG for a scale, we're talking about 120,000 meter cube. So we're a factor of 100 in terms of scale that needs to happen. So we see, not just this step, we see there's an intermediate step to kind of scale up from here and then go to commercial scale. So if I have to draw a development roadmap for liquid hydrogen supply chain, we're looking at also at like 2025 as an intermediate scale supply chain. You can take Australia to Japan as an example, but that's where we kind of build something like 10,000 meter cube vessel, and then from there on go to 100,000 meter cube type vessel. And the supply chain is not just liquid hydrogen shipping; it also includes large scale liquefaction plant. So similar development needs to happen in that space. Yeah, so this is equivalent to what used to happen in the LNG world, let's say some 60 years ago, right? When natural gas, when it needed to be moved around, there was no way to do it. And so shipping got developed for LNG, and then you scaled up from there. Liquid hydrogen is going to go through a similar journey.
Hopefully not taking 60 years.
No, we're targeting 10.
Excellent. There's a lot of catching up to do. There were a lot of comments. Actually, everybody at some point mentioned price of hydrogen, and there were some interesting numbers that came up in there. And so a lot of the prices that we hear is the kind of things start to get feasible at around $2 per kilogram. I've definitely heard that kind of the $1 per kilogram is kind of a golden space where things really start to get competitive with incumbent fuels. And Brett, you were quoting things at half that much. Did I see 50 cents per kilogram? And maybe that's way out in the desert, but I just think it'd be fun to tease out a little bit what those numbers mean and what the actual potentials are. So maybe Brett, we can start with you on your magic number there that you were putting out.
Well, that's just there looking at the energy cost, and what that's saying, it's 50 kilowatt hours to produce 1 kilogram of hydrogen. And if you do that out where you've got 1 cent, what we call 1 cent land, then that's 50 cents. That's all that's highlighting. There are other costs that have to be added to that. But I just turn to my central theme that because of the existing pipeline system, which takes us through these very low cost lands, the logical thing to do out there is we don't have ammonia pipelines, we don't have hydrogen pipelines. What we have is CH4 methane pipelines. That's why it drives us towards methane. And I think we'd all agree that the biggest cost in this is the cost of the energy. So we've chased to the point where we've got the lowest cost energy, and then we've got the existing grid infrastructure to bring it in. So yes, 1 cent times 50 kilowatt hours per kilogram gives us an energy cost of 50 cents. It then has to be added to the CO2. It has to go through the methanation process. It has to be delivered to the LNG plant. But you're coming off a very low cost base. The other products are probably going to be developed close to the port system because you want to get them into ships. You don't have those pipelines. So you're probably in minimum 4 cent land there. You see the point?
Yep.
Even we've done a lot of work in Tasmania. We think maybe we can get the energy at 4 cents a kilowatt hour. We're talking about 1/4 of that in outback Queensland and New South Wales.
Okay, great. Thank you. And Ita, maybe you have some thoughts on this, having looked at, I think, a wide range of potential geographies for this, and obviously a wide range of potential prices. Where do you see convergence, and what do you see kind of as the thresholds that start to make things possible?
So I think absolutely, as you've talked about, that kind of $2 a kilogram is a really, really critical kind of target and local production cost that starts to make hydrogen in multiple end uses. It reduces the cost premium associated. That is really a target that we think needs to be really focused in the next decade. So it's really important that by 2030, we have reached that cost tipping point in not just the most, well, certainly in the most favorable locations like Brett is talking about there, those really favorable locations, but also in some of still favorable but slightly less favorable locations globally. The other kind of critical thing that which is really picking up more on the point that Sam had mentioned earlier in terms of how do we transform or how do we transport our hydrogen if we're looking to exploit these cost differentials between regions, is really around the importance of that reconversion point for end use. So what you're looking to use your hydrogen for will very much change the cost calculation you need to do. So if you're looking to use your hydrogen for electricity production, and it's possible to directly connect electricity transmission, which obviously with Japan is more of a challenge, but where we can do direct electricity transmission lines, that is likely to be have less efficiency losses and therefore be a cheaper way of transporting for use as electricity if the energy is going to be used as electricity. If the energy is going to be used as hydrogen, we have to factor back the reconversion cost at that the location, which by definition, because we've moved it from a more favorable to a less favorable location, energy is more expensive in that local location. So the kind of the penalty for that reconversion to hydrogen can be really quite significant in terms of costs, because you're using higher cost electricity, you're not using the lower cost in the favorable region, which is one of the reasons why, very similar to Sam, we've concluded that, you know, there is a very strong case for transportation of green hydrogen as ammonia where the end use is ammonia, because you avoid that cost efficiency and cost penalty at the end point.
Great, thanks. Sam, do you want to comment on that? In particular, you were referring earlier to kind of the zero carbon ports, and first of all, you know, how those are looking at the cost of the reconversion, but then also whether those are looking at synergies between the commodity import and the bunkering and other aspects there.
Yeah, first, in terms of the cost and the prices, as I mentioned, our feasibility study shows that the blue ammonia from United States using $3 per million BTU natural gas with EOR, it was in 2018, possible to be delivered at the $2 per kilogram hydrogen equivalent. So it means an ammonia can start a market, and scale up the market can drive the cost reductions of the blue ammonia production, and also the scale up of the market can reduce the cost of the green hydrogen production and green ammonia production. That can contribute to the project of the liquid hydrogen or carbon neutral methane to reduce the cost, because on hydrogen, green hydrogen cost is very much reduced. Particularly the electrolyzer cost is a critical part to reduce the cost. And in terms of the delivery of the ammonia, as I mentioned, ammonia can be easily transported by liquid, and also we can use some existing infrastructures. So probably the cost in the delivery of the ammonia to the market is not very high. That is what we are trying to figure out, and how the ammonia can be delivered to the coal power plant or other plant. And the probably eventually that ammonia will be the global commodity through the marine fuel. If the 10% of the existing marine fuel is converted to ammonia, the total demand will be 100 million tons of ammonia. It is half of the volume currently produced in the world for fertilizers and the chemicals. It's a big volume.
And there was a question specifically that came through in the chat around to what extent will this trade flow be developed by 2030? So obviously part of this is kind of looking a long way into the future. Sam, I know you had some numbers in your slides looking at this trade flow. So my question would be, how much by 2030 versus by 2050, but also how much of it in 2030 would be green or blue versus kind of general upscaling of ammonia before we kind of get in there?
Yeah, probably in 2030, a majority of the 3 to 5 million tons of ammonia offtake volume will be blue ammonia. And what the possibility is that some of the projects are trying to use the green hydrogen into the existing ammonia plant. So the gradually scale up the green hydrogen production and green ammonia production, the step-by-step approaches. And some of the countries we are discussing have both capacity to produce blue ammonia and green ammonia. So what they are trying to do is first produce blue ammonia, cost-effective blue ammonia, and combining the green ammonia and gradually expand the green ammonia capacity, and green ammonia comes to the cost-effective level in the energy market. So in the 30s, green ammonia supply will be increased, but not by 2030.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Maybe just to shift tacks a little bit, I mean, one of the things that needs to happen for all of this is that we need to have the people, the skills, the training, the certification, and the safety aspects. And we've been talking about hydrogen. Hydrogen itself has, among some people, a bad reputation from a certain dirigible accident that took place 70 years ago. But it's not necessarily more dangerous, but has different safety aspects. So it requires different training than the fossil fuels that we're using today. Ammonia itself, again, different safety issues, some toxicity issues. What's the role, this is to all panelists, what's the role of training with kind of scaling up these new technologies, these new fuels when we're looking at transporting hydrogen? And maybe Nikunj, I'll start with you, since as a company, you guys specifically are looking at safety as a paramount importance.
Yes, I was going to jump in first, nevertheless. Yes, indeed, safety is the #1 priority in Shell. And so I think, we look at safety of hydrogen, including both liquid hydrogen and ammonia as paramount, right? I think we believe that if there's any safety incident now, that can actually spoil the hydrogen future of tomorrow. And if I can take then the example of liquid hydrogen project, which is really a pioneering project in this space that we've been doing since 2011. And we've been looking at safety of liquid hydrogen. We've been developing regulations all across the world, right? Taking an example of this vessel, the first maritime regulations to be sailing such a vessel was a very instrumental event that happened in 2013, but it required a lot of effort. And the issue is that there are no existing standards for hydrogen. So it's going to have to be based on risk. It's going to have to be based on demonstration of what works. It's going to have to be based on experimental work and measurements, and then some modeling. So all of those play into kind of determining what the right regulation for hydrogen safety is for a given application. And thereby goes the message of training, because right now, if you look across in industry, there are not too many experts on hydrogen safety. And we are developing curriculums, not just in our company, but also in many countries where we can train people on hydrogen safety. We are working with country safety standards organization to achieve that. The point indeed is, as you say, that this is a developing area, and we need everybody's attention to this. We need everybody to focus on safety, and we need for them to be experts, but they need to start somewhere. And I think a lot of resources should need to go in that dimension.
And we tend to focus on the economics, of course. That's what a lot of our conversation has been about, and about the technology. The safety is important. The safety we know is something that can be surmounted. There's no reason, I mean, obviously hydrogen is used in niche applications and ammonia is used in fertilizer industry, so there's no reason to believe that this couldn't be applied to a broader range of industries, including shipping. What are the time lags for that? Is this, are these things, are we at risk of having kind of the technology and economics ready to go and not having safety standards in place? Are there things that need to be started right away to allow this to happen in parallel?
Yeah, so they have started, and I think it's project specific, I would say. I mean, depending on what you're implementing, you need to create the standards ahead of actually going and executing that project. So it needs to actually start before you go out and do something really practical, right? Because you need to ensure whatever you're doing is safe. So it has started, and it will be, as we're scaling up, and right now the momentum around hydrogen is just amazing across the world, which means that we need to now pay equally attention on safety, because that momentum has increased. But I think I would say that safety focus is falling behind as a result of this increase in momentum. But any project that you do, any practical implementation, safety comes before actually realizing the project. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
That does, Nikunj, thank you.
Randall, it's Brett here. Can I just add to Nikunj's comments there?
Come on, Brett.
Sam and I, over a year ago, we had an opportunity to visit Tasmania, and we visited the Australian Maritime College. And the Australian Maritime College is very interested in ammonia as a carrier. And they currently have safety training facilities and courses for a lot of mariners coming from the Southeast Asian area. They are now developing one specifically for ammonia. So it's a combination of both an online training, and they actually physically come to the areas where they've got training programs. They set things on fire and they do leakages and so forth. So they are actually building the ammonia mariners safety training programs as we speak to get ready for the ammonia as bunker fuel.
Oh, Brett, and it's good to hear that. And ammonia, of course, on safety issue is very important. And we, Clean Fuel Ammonia Association, has just started the work on the safety and codes and regulations for the operation and facilities, and also the certification. But in case of the safety and code and regulations, ammonia is not new. So there are already those and the regulations in the chemical and fertilizer industries, and even in the power generation sector. They use ammonia as the denox agent. So they know, but we need to review those safety standards and how we can apply to the energy market, because the total volume is very large. But at this moment, we are planning to use fuel ammonia in the controlled areas with the trained operators for the safety reasons.
Yes, I might say the Tasmanian project or curriculum is being developed with the world-leading Ammonia Safety Training Institute, which has been operational for over 30 years, growing out of the use of ammonia in the refrigeration industry, which is even more, challenging. It's inside buildings, and also for the fertilizer industry. So there's a lot of knowledge there that can now be translated to these other purposes.
Thanks, Brett and Sam. And in addition to safety standards, there's other standards around introduction of new fuels, and especially as we're related to hydrogen. And Aita, maybe you wanted to comment on that. I'm sure the standards are something that you looked at in your work.
Absolutely. And I think, very both kind of heartened and exciting to hear about the safety work that's ongoing, and also you're very, very much in agreement with Sam's point that in a number of these areas there are existing regulations that need to be reviewed, but we can use. I wanted to kind of moving course, safety is critical, but the other kind of complementary set of standards that are also really important for scaling the use of hydrogen and clean hydrogen for decarbonisation are the clean hydrogen standards themselves. So, agreed standards and mechanisms to badge and label that clean hydrogen that is produced, and then in whatever form it's transported as such. And so, you know, really thinking about standards around the carbon intensity of the electricity that's used. Obviously, we've talked a lot today about using you know, zero carbon electricity. Some green hydrogen is also produced with grid electricity, which has carbon in that input. And then also obviously on the blue side, where we're talking about using natural gas, there's kind of 2 points that are really important. First is the level of the capture rate. So really looking for very high levels, kind of 90, 95 if possible % capture rate of CO2 that's produced during the process. And also really, really strong requirements around methane leakage through the supply chain. So through the full supply chain. If we don't capture the methane leakage, we very, very quickly can lose all benefits gained from the carbon capture process in terms of that carbon equivalent impact. And so really alongside those safety standards, also developing the traceability mechanisms and clear benchmarks that will allow potentially, especially in the 2030s, this would be really, really important if we want to think about cost premiums for clean hydrogen, for instance, and you know, people buying these products or you know, steel produced from clean hydrogen because it's clean. We need to have a very clear traceability mechanism to allow that people to have confidence in that.
Thanks, Aita. And maybe we've just got a few minutes left, so I'll ask one question to kind of pass across the panel. And that would be, I mean, at the Getting to Zero Coalition, we've got 170 companies involved from all across the supply chain, looking at all these different pieces, and not just the supply chain, but the full value chain, because we include everything from the fuels to the ports to the finance and the insurers. What could the Getting to Zero Coalition be doing to feed in on the transport side of this equation more, and helping understand the synergies between the hydrogen and the derivatives and the bunkering and all those pieces as they come together? So just kind of, what would you wish that an organization or a coalition like ours could be doing? Maybe I'll start with Nikunj, Sam, Brett, and finally Aita.
Yeah, so from my perspective, I think a coalition is indeed trying to bring organizations, people, and governments and states together. And I think that's very much needed for hydrogen industry as well, because it's indeed a global industry where collaborations and, you know, even if you take the case of export and import, the markets need to come together. So I think a coalition like yourself would be really instrumental in putting that together. So it's really developing those networks between all stakeholders that we expect, you know, as a key function of these coalitions.
Thank you, Nikunj. Brett?
Yes, I'd agree with Nikunj, and add just a flavour to it around support for particular pilot projects. So there's a number of us that are working on various projects in ammonia, in green LNG and so forth. But what we need is offtake, and we need offtake which is prepared to pay a premium at the start until we can get to mass cost reductions. So the coalition could perhaps play a role, and is in fact, I know, playing a role of highlighting what projects are on the planning board and perhaps being a bit of a matchmaker to bring the off-takers together with the project developers. Thanks, Randall.
Thanks, Brett. And we will have a matchmaking workshop coming up in June, which we'll be sharing through our networks. Sam, and then finally, Aita.
Okay, thank you. And hydrogen definitely will take a key role. And as we discussed, and we have different options, and hydrogen itself, liquid hydrogen, and the carbon neutral methane, the Brett mentioned, and also ammonia. And the coalition need to look at those different options, how those will be developed and time frame, and also the market. A different market may have different options to be fit in. So that is very important aspect we need to continue to study and discuss.
Thank you. And Aita, ETC is already a knowledge partner of the coalition. How can we continue to help drive this forward?
Really picking up on many points that have already been mentioned. I think, you know, supporting the early industrial clusters, those early real demonstration projects, and helping them to get off the ground, as has been mentioned by a number of people. And I think the other piece is really advocating for government with industry, or advocating to government with industry for the development of some of the demand side policies that will support those early off takers, and really making sure when we know there's going to be a premium, as Brett said, to get down the curve, that government, where we think this is critical for decarbonisation, that government helps support those early off take markets.
Excellent. I heard definitely matchmaking several times and pulling together that demand side and making sure that those early technologies can get out into the landscape in the real life. Thank you all for a great session. Thank you all who joined us. And as mentioned, this recording will be posted and it can be viewed later. So thank you all very much. And I look forward to continuing to make progress together.